gosh, look at the crowd.
Come this way.
Those who spread goodness radiate happiness to everyone around them. Introducing LOLC Finance Credit Cards. Fuel the goodness in you.
Welcome to LMDtv. I'm Ashwini Vethakan. Joining us this week on Talking Business is the Clinician Scientist of Leeds Hospital NHS Trust, Professor Shervanthi Homer-Vanniasinkam. Welcome to the show, Professor. It's good to have you here with us.
Thank you, Ashwini, for inviting me.
Now, Professor, by all accounts, the Omicron variant is rapidly spreading in Europe and elsewhere and is reportedly affecting a large number of people who are fully vaccinated. So how important are boosters in this scenario?
This is a really relevant question because what we have found is that people who have been so-called fully vaccinated, that is with 2 doses, are still very susceptible to getting the infection. However, the booster has been shown to have a huge effect in minimizing both infections and in particular hospitalizations and fatalities. So I think it is really important for us all to accept the fact that the booster vaccination is absolutely vital in protecting us against the Omicron variant.
Now, Israel recently reported administering its 4th booster vaccine. So what happens then? What is the need for a 4th?
That's a very good question, and I saw that also in the news. I think what we have to remember with these vaccines is that they have a period of maximum effectiveness, which is somewhere between 3 and 6 months. As that immune effectiveness wanes, then you become more susceptible to the virus in whichever variant form. So I think what countries and scientists are now doing is to study the response of the vaccine, and without getting too scientific, when you get a vaccine, the first response is an antibody response, which is the immediate response, which is usually starts waning at about a month to 6 weeks, and then the cellular response or the T cell response kicks in, which keeps us covered, the immunity covered for months, but that again starts waning. So currently what scientists are advocating is that we vaccinate the people when their immunity starts declining. We hope that in time you will be able to go towards an annual vaccine just like you do with influenza.
Now, Professor, what steps are being taken to manage the Omicron variant in other countries such as the UK?
So in addition to accelerating the deployment of the booster, the government has also brought in or reinstated several measures such as wearing face coverings when out in public places, social distancing, and from the 15th of December they have made it mandatory that people show evidence of being fully vaccinated before going to certain venues such as pubs and shows, etc.
Currently, Sri Lanka is rolling out the Pfizer boosters for people over 20, and more than 85% of people over 16 have received both doses. So how do you view this track record and the vaccination process in Sri Lanka?
I've been in Sri Lanka now for just over a month, and I have been absolutely positively astounded by the exemplary vaccination program that is being carried out in this country. As you say, the numbers of people who have been vaccinated is very high. And I think as more of the vulnerable population, the highly vulnerable population get vaccinated, one hopes that particularly this Omicron variant will not get a stranglehold of the country. So I think as a country we should be very proud of this achievement, and I hope that the public will appreciate the huge efforts made by the authorities to implement the booster program.
Now, Professor, how about vaccine equity across the world? How and when can we achieve this in your view?
So vaccine equity is a very important factor, and there is, as you know, a global alliance looking at this. Initially, there was a hesitancy on the part of the countries, particularly the more developed countries, to release extra doses of vaccines that they had, because they were not sure whether they were going to have to give more than 2 doses, and you've seen that the booster has become necessary. So I think we shouldn't be too critical of that. However, we must also accept the fact that there is no way we can combat this disease unless the entire world is vaccinated, which is a huge challenge. Very encouragingly, I see that the Vaccine Alliance has been able to work with Big Pharma, and there's been a preponement of vaccine doses. So doses that were going to be released in 2022 are being released currently. And in particular, these are being distributed to what we call the LMICs, the low and middle income countries. So I think that's very, very positive move on the part of the Vaccine Alliance, working with pharma.
Professor, in many parts of the world, including here in Sri Lanka, the under 16 age group has not been considered for vaccination. Why is this? Is it because the potential for side effects outweigh the safety of the vaccination?
So again, this has been addressed in studies that have been done recently. So we have now found that from a study that has been published and some more studies coming on board, that the 12 to 15-year-olds also get significant protection from being vaccinated. There is no treatment, even not just talking of vaccine, there is no treatment that is without side effects. But what we have to look at is balancing the risks of the disease and its consequences against the risks of vaccination. And so the recent data from the 12 to 15-year-olds is very positive in favor of vaccination, and I'm sure that in due course this will be rolled out.
And on that note, we'll be going in for a short break.
You love the feeling of being renewed. To stay beautiful every single day. To breathe just like we do, because you are truly delicate. Protecting the ones who've been with us through the years. With Sayalac Care, the only wood coating that truly protects you. Sayalac Wood Coatings from JAT.
Welcome back to the show as we continue our conversation with Professor Shervanthi Homer-Vanniasinkam. Now, Professor, would you say the response to the pandemic is a testament of their importance of cross-disciplinary efforts vis-a-vis science and medicine?
Very much so. As a clinician, practicing clinician, clinician scientist, and a clinician engineer, I work across all these disciplines. I have seen this huge collaboration during the pandemic. So, for example, as political borders have locked down, academic and scientific boundaries have absolutely dissolved with the sharing of information right from the incept when the SARS-CoV-2 virus genome was both studied and openly published so that people could use this to look for effective therapies. So that was where I think that the first indication of the openness of science. Then we must remember that scientists who were working on this mRNA technology for other indications very quickly pivoted their efforts and brought out these very effective vaccines. I think we cannot forget the huge contribution of the scientists. But that alone is not enough, because you have then got to manufacture these vaccines in huge doses and transport them across several thousands of miles. So there the engineers and the manufacturing academics and industry and the logistics of transport have all come into play. When you look at medicine, the clinicians have designed and implemented hundreds of clinical trials. At very short notice, they have interpreted the data and given us the results and helped us to look at how we might combat the disease. So you can see all these different disciplines coming together in a way that perhaps they haven't for over a century.
As for science, what are we learning about pandemics such as this, and what lessons are there for humanity?
We have many lessons. First of all, I think, when we talk of pandemics, everybody thinks about the pandemic of over 100 years ago. So that was the Spanish flu, which I think was 1918 to 1920. Where 500 million people were affected with 50 million deaths. We then had the infections more recently, the 2003 SARS infection, 2012 the MERS infection, and then of course in the Western world we are used to having the flu epidemic every winter. What we learned from this is that these infections will happen. May not be on such a large scale, but after this pandemic, all countries have come together to look at pandemic preparedness, and sharing of information once again in this sector is really important, because I'm sure in the future we will have further epidemics and maybe even a pandemic, and we've got to learn from this current pandemic that there are ways to effectively combat the disease.
So are we right in saying that the goal now is to see the virus transition from a pandemic to an endemic?
I'm not an authority on this. The epidemiologists and the modelers have certainly looked at this very closely and published extensively on it. The hope is that this will move from being a pandemic to being an endemic state, much like the flu influenza virus. I think it is reasonable to have this hope, but whilst that is being hoped for, I think we should not let our guard down, because we have seen the consequences and the price that we pay if we start relaxing the rules too early.
Now, Professor, you've been in Sri Lanka for an extensive period of time and would have obviously driven around various vaccination drives. Would you be able to tell us your thoughts on how Sri Lanka is coping with the pandemic right now?
So if I take the question of the vaccination program, in particular the booster program, yes, I have driven past the centers where these are being administered, and I'm really very heartened by how effectively this is being rolled out. It's an orchestrated movement. There's a walk-in center, the booster is administered, they stay the 15-20 minutes afterwards and they come home. And I think this is really, really commendable for a country such as Sri Lanka. I can't overemphasize the importance of that. In terms of the other measures that Sri Lanka has taken over the past 18 to 20 months, again, I think they have been carefully thought out, not just knee-jerk responses. For example, the schools have been closed for quite a considerable period of time. Now, that has had both positive and negative effects. But these young people who are in the main transmitters of the disease, they have been at home, and hence this transmission has been mitigated. And we must remember, we are a society where we live with our parents and our grandparents. So these more susceptible and highly vulnerable people have also been protected by these measures. So overall, I'd say, if I took a 360-degree view of what the country has done in terms of combating and dealing with this pandemic, I think it is highly commendable.
And what does your crystal ball say about when life might return to normal?
I hope so. I think the whole world hopes so. But I would reiterate the fact that we have to be patient. I know people's patience is wearing thin. Economies are suffering. Families are crippled by the effects of not being able to work. But there is very little other option. And if you look at how this whole scenario is playing out, even with this latest variant, what we do see is that these variants of concern are becoming less lethal. So the Omicron variant, for example, which is very, very transmissible, a study just being published by the University of Edinburgh has shown that the booster dose prevents has a two-thirds effect in preventing hospitalization and is highly effective against serious illness. So we are going in the right direction, but being able to put a date on it, I think, is always dangerous. We just got to study the trend.
Our final question for you this evening, Professor. What is your message for the anti-vaxxers among us?
A very, very emotional and emotive subject. And as a clinician, I am surrounded by questions almost every day about this. I think we have to be very careful how we deal with this. Coercion and trying to implement this by any sort of rule of force, I don't think will work. There's a lot of mistrust and misinformation, as you know, out there. And I think what we have to do is to try and guide these people into realizing the rationale for vaccination and showing them the clear scientific evidence that vaccination is really the way out of this pandemic. I would also like to say that we must not forget the role of our other colleagues in the social sciences and in behavioral science. I think these people are really important in getting this message out. Sometimes we as scientists and clinicians do not have the adequate tools to educate the public in a patient way, and I think these colleagues have a very vital role to play. My final sentiment is this: vaccination is an injection of hope for all of us.
Well, this has been an interesting conversation, and we are encouraged by your parting words where the vaccination is an injection of hope for all of us. Thank you for joining us on the show this evening, Professor.
It's been a pleasure talking to you.
Coming up, we have the latest from Sri Lanka's burning issues. Stay tuned. Welcome back, and here's the latest from Sri Lanka's burning issues. With worries of new COVID-19 variants impacting countries, in addition to the first case of the Omicron variant being detected in Sri Lanka in early December, a larger scale of respondents to the latest LMDtv Business Confidence Index, or BCI, pointed to the spread of the coronavirus being their main concern compared to the previous month. In early December, 84%, up from 78% in the preceding month, of survey respondents cited the impact of the pandemic as the most pressing issue for business in Sri Lanka today. Following the virus in terms of business concerns is inflation, which continued to be viewed as a major issue for corporates, with 78% of those consulted by the pollsters highlighting it compared to 73% in November. Concerns about political instability are also growing, with 47% versus 36% in the previous month of the survey sample, saying it is a pressing issue for business. When it comes to the most pressing national issue facing Sri Lanka, the spread of COVID-19 continues to be cited as the main concern, according to 81%, the same as in November, of survey participants. Poverty also continued to be perceived as a pressing issue for the country, as a majority, 67% of respondents, consider this to be a concern. This marks an increase from the 51% who expressed such an opinion in the preceding month. The economy is also deemed to be a national concern, according to 59% of those surveyed. And that's all we have for you this week. Don't forget to subscribe to our YouTube channel and follow us on Facebook and Twitter. Thank you for watching, and stay safe.